There's a place in Nova Scotia known locally as Little Girl's Grave. It is a gravestone of a young girl named Catherine McIntosh. She died of an illness and was originally buried in McLennan Cemetery. However, due to a dispute with a neighbor, her body was dug up and moved to the side of Greenvale Road in front of the family farm. One night, I went with 2 friends to visit the gravestone. It was a dark and gloomy night, driving down the eerie winding dirt road until we came upon the location. We brought a toy to leave at the gravestone. The local lore surrounding this site says to leave a toy for her and to never take a toy away. It wasn't until we left and began driving down the dirt road that we had a paranormal experience. We noticed in the front windshield, in the condensation, a small child's footprint on the glass. It was so detailed and human-like, it scared us quite a bit, to say the least. One of the friends I had visited the gravesite with, we worked at the same restaurant at the time. A few days after we visited the site, we were working together and we both heard something truly bizarre. It was the sound of a child laughing very faintly. We both stared at each other in disbelief. We had no idea where the sound originated from whatsoever, as there was no one around except the 2 of us. Not long after this, we had a falling out, and have not spoken with each other since 2013. This is one of the only paranormal experiences that I've encountered in my life. If anyone who reads this has had similar experiences at the gravestone, please share it with this community. Thank you for reading my story, and may you all have a good evening. This is a story about an old house in a rural part of central Massachusetts. It was a huge old house that had originally been half a hotel. The other half was nearby. For some reason, it was split in half and the halves moved apart. That always perplexed me. It was a huge 3-story Victorian structure with wide porches. How and why the building was split was never explained to me. The house was owned by some friends of my parents. They would host parties with lots of people, and the women would play the piano and sing. There were lots of kids there, and we would run around inside and outside, while the adults socialized. My memories of the house are vague, as this was more than 40 years ago. I do remember that the house was huge, and had way more rooms than the family that lived there could use. Up on the 3rd floor, there were several hotel rooms with doors, largely unchanged since it was an operating hotel. The family that lived there openly talked about the house being haunted. I was fascinated by their stories as a child. Odd things would happen, such as repeatedly finding the telephone receiver out of its cradle and sitting on the table next to the phone. Light bulbs would go missing, apparently unscrewed from the socket and spirited away. The one anecdote that left the deepest impression on me was one that the mother of the family told us happened to her. One afternoon, she was vacuuming one of the rooms on the 3rd floor. She turned around and was startled to see a man standing in the room, motionless and staring at her. She described him as a man in a gray suit, wearing wide-rimmed glasses. He didn't say a word and just stood staring at her. Caught off guard and flustered by the man's sudden appearance, she said the first thing that came to mind. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" He simply disappeared before her eyes. I never understood why someone would offer a cup of coffee to an apparition, but my mother said that the woman explained it as she was aware that the house had an apparent presence, and that she felt like it was benevolent, and she wanted the presence to feel welcome. I wish that I had more details to share. I wonder if the house is still there today. So, I worked at a county jail. One night, I was working the maximum security unit on the night shift. It was pretty boring, with nothing to really do except checks, where you go around and look in each cell every 30 minutes or so to make sure that everything was okay and the inmates weren't doing anything that they weren't supposed to. It had been about 15 minutes or so since my last check, and I was sitting in the control room reading a book to pass the time. The control room sits higher than the floor level and looks out over the cell block. If a person average height were to walk right by, you would only see the top of their head. As I'm reading my book, I see out of my peripheral the top of a bald head walk past the window. I knew that nobody else was in the area, as another officer would have to go through 2 sets of remotely open doors, and there was no way past my control room. I looked up and into the cell block. I didn't see anyone. I then looked at the camera monitors, which showed every angle of the cell block. Still nothing. I put my book down and exited the control room, making sure to lock the door behind me in case an inmate got out of their cell. They couldn't lock me out of the control room. It's uncommon, but it is possible. I walked into the cell block, shining my flashlight into some of the more dimly lit areas. I took notice that I did not hear the cell door close, so if an inmate did get out of the cell, they would have either had to close their cell door incredibly quietly, or they were hiding somewhere. I radioed for another officer to respond to my location as a backup. I began to conduct a check, making sure to count the inmates in each cell and pull on the door to make sure it was locked. When I reached the upper tier, one of the inmates was standing at the cell window and asked me what time it was. When I told him, he noted that I was early on my check and that I had been checking the doors. These guys have nothing to do but watch you. The inmate asked if I saw the bald-headed guy. He must have seen the expression on my face, because he said that he was seen by someone at least once a night, usually passing quickly by the cell windows. He said that they always knew it was him because there were no bald officers on night shift. I went back to the control room and locked it behind me. I asked the officer who responded as my backup about the bald-headed guy. He was a very senior officer and said that he had never personally seen him, but it wasn't uncommon for officers to report it. I never saw the bald-headed guy again. Eventually I was promoted, and every once in a while, an officer or inmate will ask me about him. Before I go into this story, I want to preface that everything I'm telling you is 100% no bullshit. This happened to me in my early teens. I'm 21 now. My best friend growing up had this huge farmhouse in the middle of Virginia. It was very old and beautiful, but also had a very dark history. In the house, there is a tunnel that led to an underground room of sorts that was used for slaves to hide in the 1800s. And I'm 90% sure that some died down there while hiding. So you can imagine the history and energy that fills the house. I always felt scared there. I never felt alone and wouldn't go anywhere alone in the house, even just to grab something out of my room. Even the family was scared to stay there with no company because of the intense apparitions and experiences, which I can get into another day. The rooms were massive, and the entire house was white, with honestly creepy vintage decor. There was even a cabinet of fucking ventriloquist dolls upstairs. No joke. They were a really odd family, honestly, with lots of dark problems. Anyways, the second time I visited that house, I was with my mom, my best friend at the time, and her mom. It was a girls' trip. One night, I woke up and was so thirsty, but the last thing I wanted to do was go downstairs and get water. I was terrified. I hated that house at night, but my mom was dead asleep, so I literally sprinted downstairs with my head only looking at the floor. I made my water in 5 seconds, and when I made it to the stairs, something compelled me to look at the giant glass doors that were in front of the stairs. I was horrified, but I felt like I needed to look out the window. What I saw when I looked out that window will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw a man, as real as anything I've ever seen. It was pitch black outside with a huge bright moon. The man was all black, like a silhouette, but because of the moon behind so bright, I could clearly see his entire body. He was blacker than black. Like he stood out so much, I 100% thought he was a trespasser. He was wearing a top hat and was unhumanly tall, like 7 feet. My heart literally felt like it stopped beating. I felt like I was in a trance. I was so unexplainably horrified. but I couldn't look away. He was moving a little bit, almost like breathing. Then about 10 seconds later, he was gone, disappearing into thin air. I fucking panicked and bolted upstairs. After I snapped out of my trance, I cried to my mom and was up all night. The next morning, I told my friend and her mom about the experience, and they were not shocked at all, as they had seen multiple full-body apparitions in the house themselves. The nanny that worked for them even refused to go in some rooms of the house. I never went back to that house again.